You're listening to Wild About Arizona, the official podcast of the Arizona Game and Fish Department.
And welcome to Wild About Arizona. I'm John Treeweiler with the Arizona Game and Fish Department. On this episode of Wild About Arizona, we're talking about the infamous rattlesnake in Arizona, a sound that is unmistakable and will most likely stop you in your tracks. Arizona is home to 13 species of rattlesnake, the most of any other state. So to talk about it with us today, we brought in the Arizona Game and Fish Department's Tom Jones, Amphibians and Reptiles Program Manager. Tom, thanks for being with us.
John, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
So first of all, tell us about your role and kind of what you do here at the Arizona Game and Fish Department.
Sure. I'm the Amphibians and Reptiles Program Manager, as you said, and in that role, I direct amphibian and reptile species conservation throughout the state of Arizona. I have a staff of 5 full-time employees that do most of the groundwork for amphibian and reptile conservation. We work with our partners in the regions to accomplish conservation, as well as outside partners at Phoenix Zoo, the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum, and so forth.
Because you're busy with amphibians, with reptiles, but today we are talking about probably one of the most famous reptiles, at least when you think Arizona,
right.
The rattlesnake. And as we just mentioned, 13 different species of rattlesnake in Arizona, the most of any other state. Just right there, that's pretty impressive biodiversity.
It is. It's really impressive biodiversity. The closest that any other state comes is New Mexico, that has 9 species, and most of those species we share with them.
Okay.
Here in Arizona. A lot of what gives Arizona higher biodiversity in snakes is our close geographic location to Mexico. A lot of our species that we have occur in Mexico and nowhere else, but they barely come into Arizona.
Gotcha. When it comes to the biology of these rattlesnakes, Tom, I mean, they're pretty fascinating creatures, and you as a biologist and you and your team work with them. Most people are pretty afraid of rattlesnakes or don't really know a lot about them, but they're really fascinating. Can you talk to us just about kind of some of the interesting things that is about a rattlesnake? I know I was reading last night about they have the heat sensing organ that kind of helps them detect prey and predators, right?
Yeah. So I'll give you a little bit more background. Arizona, as you said, has 13 species, but rattlesnakes occur virtually all over the country. And they occur from the East Coast and southern Canada all the way to the West Coast, the Pacific Northwest, and then down into Mexico. And in fact, Mexico has more species of rattlesnake than any other part of the world.
Oh, wow.
Rattlesnakes are part of a larger group called vipers. And all vipers have the same kind of construction of their bodies and their venom apparatus, as we call it. These are venomous snakes. They when they bite, they inject a toxin. They inject a venom into their prey, and all vipers have that. They have the same sort of venom apparatus, a hypodermic-like needle apparatus that injects venom into their prey. But then rattlesnakes are part of a subset of those vipers, and they all have the heat-sensing pits that you described a moment ago. The heat-sensing pit is located between the eye and the nostril, and it actually senses infrared radiation.
Okay.
And it does so in a fascinating way that we're only learning more about in the last decade or so, that the infrared detection is actually coupled with vision in the brain. So the rattlesnake actually has a picture of what it's detecting through infrared and through its vision. And the infrared detection is for prey detection, because so many of the prey items of rattlesnakes and their relatives, which are called pit vipers, are warm-blooded prey. So their temperature is a little bit higher than the background, and they sense that with the pits and strike their prey, envenomate them. That immobilizes or kills their prey.
That's a new word, envenomate, for me. That sounds pleasant, envenomate. Is that like a thermal imaging camera? Like,
yes.
Kind of for basically that's what that is for them. It's their own built-in thermal imaging camera.
Very much like that, yes. Yeah. And the whole idea is to detect a temperature that's different from the background. So the background might be fairly cool, but that animal, as soon as it steps into the field of view, it's obvious. It's warm and different. And that's the time that the animal strikes to obtain its prey.
Huh. And with rattlesnakes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but typically they wait for the prey to come to them, right?
That is correct. Most rattlesnakes are what we call sit and wait predators.
Okay.
That is, they use chemical cues like smell, taste, to find a spot to sit where they have detected their prey. It might be a runway where mice go back and forth or something like that. So they will just sit, coil up quietly, and they may wait for days in that position for a prey item to come by. And then once a prey item comes by, they strike it, track it, because it typically doesn't get killed right away, so the animal crawls away, and then they use their chemical senses to track that animal until they find it. Then they pick it up, eat it, and they go off someplace else.
And typically, rattlesnakes are pretty hidden, aren't they, Tom?
Correct.
And where most people probably wouldn't even see a rattlesnake. You really, if you want to see a rattlesnake in Arizona, you'd have to really kind of go look for it or be in the right spot. Kind of talk to us about where these snakes kind of live and mainly where they are.
Sure. They live everywhere.
No comfort there.
How's that for comforting? Yeah. Well, I mean, seriously, like I said, we had 13 species, so they cover all of Arizona, from some of the highest elevations on down to the lowest desert elevations. And as you said, they don't want to be seen. They don't want to be seen by their prey. They don't want to be seen by their predators. So they're very what is called cryptically colored. They blend in with their background in most cases, or they hide in places that they can't be seen. So many people have said to me that I've lived in Arizona for 20 years, I go hiking all the time, I've never seen a rattlesnake. And my response to them is, well, they've probably seen you. Because they are cryptic. They tend to stay quiet. They don't want to be seen by what they perceive as a potential predator. So they'll just stay quiet in the side of the trail, let you pass by.
Well, this is such a comforting conversation we're having, Tom. They've probably seen you. If you were to encounter one, you probably would hear the rattle, the sound. I mean, that's the maybe. And
yes.
Talk to us about the rattle, because that's probably. I mean, obviously it's in the name, rattlesnake,
Sure. Yep.
and it's a very distinctive, very interesting sound when it goes off. Talk to us about it and why they would use it and everything about it.
Sure. So to start with, the rattle is kind of a unique structure anyway. The rattle is built up every time the animal sheds. It adds a segment to its rattle. So the rattle itself is just all these loosely connected segments of keratin, basically the same thing that makes up your fingernails or your hair and the skin of a snake. So it's a hard substance, but then when the interlocking segments hit one another, it makes that kind of clicking sound. And the tail muscle in a rattlesnake is the fastest twitching muscle in a vertebrate. So when they rattle, they are vibrating their tails at an incredibly fast rate. And that's the sound that you hear, that rattling. And the sound, the way I've heard it described, that I think is the best way to describe it, it's a defensive mechanism. It's not an offensive mechanism. And the rattlesnake is basically saying, do you hear that sound? Do you remember how much it hurt the last time you heard that sound? So it's basically saying, back off. And in an evolutionary sense, predators that have attacked rattlesnakes and been bitten have later avoided them, and they avoid them because they hear that sound, and that sound is distinctive. So when a rattlesnake rattles, it's a warning to whomever is close to get back. I don't want to mess with you, but if you mess with me, I'm going to get angry. But most rattlesnakes will not rattle if they can help it. They're going to try and get away. They're either going to hide or they're going to try and slip away quietly. So you don't always hear them rattling. But they always have a rattle. We get calls all the time about, I have a rattlesnake in my yard, but it doesn't have a rattle. I said, well, that's probably not a rattlesnake then. Their rattles can break off, but they're still going to have a remnant of that rattle on the end of the tail.
And so would that rattle get bigger as as the age of the snake grows, the rattle will then grow too?
It's not necessarily age related.
Okay.
To some extent it's age related, but it's not a clear linear relationship. That is, the rattle puts on a new segment every time the animal sheds. And the shedding cycle depends on how often they eat. So if they're eating a lot and they're growing, then they're going to shed their skin more often. And then they will add rattles. So they could add 2, 3, 4 rattles in a year. So you can't really age them by the rattle. But the longer the rattle, probably the older the snake. Although in most cases, rattles break off at the ends.
Okay.
So you don't have a full rattle anyway, in an older snake anyway.
When it comes to rattlesnakes in Arizona, we've already established 13 species. What's the most common, the most popular one? Is it the Western Diamondback or?
Well, most common and most popular are two different
That's
things.
true.
The most commonly encountered rattlesnake in Arizona is the Western Diamondback.
Okay.
Yes. And it's one of the larger snakes. And it's probably responsible for more bites than most other rattlesnakes in Arizona because it is common. Western Diamondbacks are found in deserts and grasslands and in woodlands. They're quite widespread in much of Arizona.
Okay. When we think rattlesnakes, and as we've been talking about here, most people would not be a fan of seeing a rattlesnake. They don't want to see a rattlesnake. They really want to avoid it. Most people are probably afraid of the snake itself, but it's probably actually the snake is maybe just as afraid of you. Is that correct?
Yeah, and it sounds like you're speaking from personal experience, John.
Yeah. I am just not a snake person, Tom. I'm glad we didn't bring one with us to have on display today. But
so fear, we often say that animals are more afraid of us than we are of them, and it might not necessarily be fear, but it's self-preservation. They don't want to be seen because they perceive us, gigantic mammals compared to them. They perceive us as potential predators. So they don't want to be seen. They're not necessarily afraid, but they don't want to mess with us. So they want to hide or they want to get away. And then if you mess with them, they're going to defend themselves.
Yeah, we often do some messaging with you in the springtime regarding rattlesnakes being more active, and you're more likely to see them come the springtime. Could you talk to us about the time of year when people are most likely to encounter a rattlesnake in Arizona, Tom?
Sure, and that varies by elevation throughout the state. But, excuse me, it is often the case that a lot of rattlesnakes are seen in the early spring because they're just coming out of their overwintering sites where they've been quiet all winter. And then they're moving to their feeding sites or they're looking for mates, so they're moving more than they would ordinarily. And that's why folks often see them in the spring. And the early spring in Yuma may be February, whereas up in Pine Top it's going to be April or something like that. But they are also quite active during the monsoon. Throughout the state. And that's because a lot of their prey are quite active during the monsoon. Conditions in general are more conducive to being out. It's often cooler, it's wet, they can get water. So that's another time that people often see snakes, including rattlesnakes.
If you do see a rattlesnake, if you do encounter one, whether it's in your yard or maybe you're out hiking, enjoying the wilderness, what do you do, Tom?
Leave it alone.
It's that simple.
It really is that simple. What you don't do is try and shoo it off the trail. Don't try to kill it. Don't try to manipulate it. Just leave it alone. And what I say to folks, and this is not often taken in the right light, but I say enjoy it because these are fascinating creatures. watch it. Watch what it does. If it's standing still, you can watch it. If it's moving, you can watch it go off the trail. But give it a wide berth. You don't have to run from it. You don't have to fear it. If it's rattling, you're going to hear that before you get to it, more than likely, unless you have your earbuds in and you're listening to music.
Sure.
But watch where you put your feet. But I think the most important thing is to just leave the snake alone. Give it a wide berth. Don't run. Don't mess with it. Don't try to handle it. That's when trouble starts.
Yeah, and that really leads into my next question, is that bites, they do happen.
Absolutely.
People do get bit by rattlesnakes,
Yep.
but it sounds like the majority of the time, because someone's getting bit, it's because they're provoking the snake or they're doing something they really shouldn't be doing.
That's absolutely correct. There are certainly cases of what are called legitimate bites. That is, someone had no idea the rattlesnake was there, and they were bitten quite by accident. But legitimate bites are far less common than illegitimate bites, bites that are caused by people handling or provoking rattlesnakes. And much of that takes place when people are intoxicated or they're trying to show off, and that's when accidents happen in general. And with a rattlesnake, it can be a little bit more serious.
So whether it's a legitimate bite or it's somebody doing something they shouldn't be doing, if a bite does occur, what's the next course of action?
The next course of action is very simple: 911.
Okay.
Nowadays, virtually everyone has a cell phone, and the first thing that should be done is to call 911. Let the professionals handle it. Now, certainly, try to stay calm, but really, who's going to stay calm when they're bitten by a rattlesnake? We say that all the time. Try to stay calm. But if you've just been bitten by a rattlesnake, it hurts. But at least try to stay calm. Remove rings or watches or things from the extremity that's been bitten. But don't do anything like trying to suck out the venom. Don't try to cut the fang marks open and draw blood. Don't put a tourniquet on. Don't apply ice. Don't do any of that stuff. Let the professionals take it. If you're so far from any kind of professional help, hopefully you have someone with you that can help you get out slowly but carefully. But the most important thing is 911. And most bites don't happen out in the wilderness. Most bites happen in the city or close to cities, and professional help can get there quite quickly.
Yeah, and why is that so important, that we don't add ice or try to suck out the venom or do things like that are kind of misconceptions that people hear? This is what I'm supposed to be doing.
Well, in many cases, you can cause more damage by doing those things than by leaving it alone. Rattlesnakes have predominantly a venom that causes damage to tissues. And when ice is applied to a bite site, then circulation slows considerably, and then the venom stays right there. So you're concentrating the venom at the site of the bite, and therefore that venom is acting more on the tissues locally, and it's breaking those tissues down, literally breaking down the muscle and the skin and the blood vessels and such. The same if one puts a tourniquet on. It stops circulation. And if you try to, in the old days, they used to say, put a little X mark with a razor blade and suck the venom out. And if you happen to cut a vein or an artery, that's going to be pretty serious business, much more serious than your rattlesnake bite, your snake bite. So all of those things cause more damage to the person than the bite itself will likely cause.
Overall, call 911, but
911.
Even more, it sounds like if you're doing the right thing, you really shouldn't even have that problem.
Correct. And like you pointed out earlier, accidents do happen.
Right.
Even if you're doing everything right, sometimes someone gets bitten by a rattlesnake. And in those cases, just let the professionals handle it. And in Arizona, we have amazing health professionals that know exactly what to do with snake bite because they experience it. They've had the They've had the time to train themselves.
Snakes, as we've already established, can be anywhere in Arizona.
Yes.
We live here in Arizona. Sometimes they can get onto your property. They can be seen around your house, maybe even in your house. What should you do if that's the case? If someone sees a rattlesnake on their property and manages to get in their home, what do they do?
Well, if it's in your yard and you feel comfortable doing so, let it do its thing, and it'll probably leave before long. But many people have pets in their yard, and they don't want a rattlesnake there. So there are a variety of organizations and companies that will move rattlesnakes off your property if you call them. The list is too long, and I'm not going to call out any particular company, but in some cases, local fire departments will handle that. But that's certainly not always the case. And there are nonprofit organizations that I will mention: Arizona Herpetological Association, the Phoenix Herpetological Sanctuary. They provide those services, and they are nonprofit organizations, but they do charge for it because it takes time away from other things that they do. But there are professionals out there. There are companies with highly professional staffs that will come out and move the rattlesnake for you. And they'll move it to a wild site nearby. They won't kill the snake. They'll do the right thing for it biologically, move it to an appropriate habitat away from homes.
What's the biggest misconception that you hear or deal with, Tom, when it comes to rattlesnakes in Arizona?
I think the biggest misconception is that they're aggressive. And people get that perception of rattlesnakes because oftentimes when they encounter rattlesnakes, the snake has been disturbed and it's rattling. And they rise up in a loose coil. They're very menacing looking, and they're rattling, and they might strike if somebody's nearby or if they perceive that there's something nearby. And automatically people say, okay, look, they're aggressive. Well, no, that's just defensive. They're not being aggressive. They're not going to chase you. They're going to try and get away. But people think that because of behaviors like that snakes are aggressive. And sometimes a snake will perceive its only way to get away is in the same direction that you are. And they'll start moving in that direction. And people think that snakes are attacking them. They're not. They're just trying to get the heck out of the way.
And, it sounds like people should know what to do with living with rattlesnakes. They should know what to do should an emergency happen, but they shouldn't have this overall fear of
visceral fear. Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's a hard thing to control. A lot of people do have a visceral reaction to snakes in general, and to rattlesnakes in particular because they perceive them as dangerous. And the way to get over that certainly is through education and experience. And I think if one stops and watches a snake, you learn a whole lot more about them as just an ordinary creature in the wild that's doing its thing, and a fascinating one at that.
I'll watch snakes with you, I guess, Tom.
I figured that was coming, John.
If people want to learn more about what you do here at Arizona Game and Fish, or about reptiles, rattlesnakes, or even amphibians, where can they go?
Well, they can go to the Game and Fish website. There are web pages there that can educate them about rattlesnakes. We have a website that's called reptilesofaz.org, where people can go to learn about amphibians and reptiles in general in the state. We have a field guide that the Game and Fish Department produces that is probably one of the most popular field guides in the entire country. It's a field guide to amphibians and reptiles of Arizona. It's inexpensive. It's available in many places through the department. And that's a great way to learn about reptiles and amphibians in general.
Well, Tom, thanks so much for being here with us today. Again, thank you for not bringing a live rattlesnake to the program, and really appreciate your time.
You're quite welcome, and thank you for taking the time to do this, because it's an important topic that the public needs to understand, that rattlesnakes are not their enemy, They're a fascinating part of the rich biodiversity that Arizona has to offer.
Thanks for listening. Visit us online at www.azgfd.gov.